What makes a good Lovecraft movie adaptation? It is a question that many writers and directors have tried to solve with varying quality of the outcome. It is a question without a good answer. Is it the use of color? Is it the use of character? Is it proper encapsulation of a cosmic entity in a visual medium? I would argue it is none of these things. The very nature of many of Lovecraft's beasts and gods is that they are completely alien to human understanding. The very nature of Lovecraft's writing also often hinges on a mystery that leads to story and then is answered by the end either directly or vaguely. We could see this in The Call of Cthulhu, at the Mountains of Madness, and The Statement of Randolph Carter. And many other works kind of focus on this central mystery to the story that drives it forward. Another very important piece of the Lovecraft formula is setting, and I would argue that setting is the most important component in Lovecraftian work. Often the protagonists in Lovecraft fiction are stuck or trapped in a singular location, such as a cave or a submarine or the Antarctic, or trapped in a locality such as in the shadow over Innsmouth. There is one final element, though, that truly makes Lovecraftian work what it is. And that component, that element, is obsession and madness. Which brings me to 2022's movie Glorious, which is very, very, very loosely based on the horror at the museum by H.P. Lovecraft and Hazel Heald. Glorious is a movie that carries its Lovecraftian influence well, and it doesn't look right while also being very frustratingly distant from the material that it's supposed to be based on. I'm going to talk a lot about how it's not even closely, not even vaguely in the same ballpark as the horror at the museum, but it gets so much stuff right that I still like it. So from here on out, we're in spoiler territory and we're completely off script. I'm just going to talk about plot beats from the movie, things that the movie does right, things that it does wrong. Now, if you're the kind of person who doesn't like spoilers, go ahead and just click off the video now and come back later after you've seen Glorious and see if you agree with me. Me personally, I love spoilers. If you tell me the ending of a show, I sit there and I think, wow, that's a cool ending. I wonder how they got there. So if you like me, stick around and we're going to talk about this movie. Then you can go watch it and come back and yell at me if you disagree with me. Either way is fine. Our movie begins as we follow a very gross-looking protagonist as he's driving through the countryside or on a highway, something like that. And he eventually comes upon a rest stop and kind of just sets up shop there. We find out that Wes is newly homeless. We find out that he is struggling with some sort of drama between him and his most recent girlfriend. And we get introduced to this weird harbinger character, this sort of woman with some kind of like facial burn. And she kind of says like vague things to Wes that seem to come straight out of like dialogue from Lovecraftian novels. So that was automatically great. And then she kind of tells Wes how to best live in his car and then kind of just leaves. She just leaves. But on her way out, we see her looking at this goopy flower and smiling, which I love as a sort of like nod to what is going to happen in the story. And it's done really well. It's done in this way that makes you know that there is some sort of like eldritch thing happening here. If you're familiar with Lovecraft in any capacity. This seam here just feels like it belongs in a Lovecraft story. That night, Wes decides to get incredibly drunk and have himself a little bonfire. He burns a bunch of mementos from his past relationship, but kind of holds on to a picture that we're going to see a couple times in this movie. And it's a nice little detail. The following morning, he has to expel the contents of his stomach forcefully and kind of charges into the rest stop bathroom. He heaves up the contents of his stomach and notices an odd graffiti on the side of the stall. And this graffiti is deeply disturbing, to say the least. I can only show about like the top 1/3 of it. But inside of the mouth of this horrifying creature is a hole cut between the two stalls. And I don't know what that hole is for. For the sake of YouTube, I don't know what it's for. Is that a thing that happens? Does this have a name? I don't know. I just don't know. YouTube, I don't know what this is. Then Wes begins to hear a voice from the stall over. And the voice is done by J.K. Simmons, the same guy who does the voice of Omni-Man in Invincible. And honestly, good casting choice. If you're going to make anyone's voice an elder god, it's got to be like Keith David or J.K. Simmons. Those are like the two top tier choices. So the J.K. Simmons guy in the closed stall begins talking with Wes, and they kind of have this weird dialogue between them. The voice of J.K. Simmons having this very Sheldon Cooper vibe where he can describe and name all 127 bacteria now living in Wes's eyes. So that's a fun dynamic. I think it's actually a fun way to portray an elder god too, letting them have this sort of stilted Sheldon Cooper style of speech because they're so disassociated from humanity. And then Wes, on the other hand, is sort of like, I don't know, kind of like an antisocial character. Like he's got something not quite right with him and his own connection to humanity, which makes a really good juxtaposition and similarity between the two characters all at once. This back and forth goes on for a while until Wes introduces himself by name, and eventually the J.K. Simmons character asks Wes, "Would you like to know my name?" And what happens next is possibly one of the most fun scenes for somebody who has invested a lot of time in looking into like Lovecraftian history. In order to say the J.K. Simmons character's name correctly, J.K. Simmons instructs Wes to hold out his tongue and grip it between his thumb and index finger, and then instructs him to say, "Got another one." And he leads him down this path of saying it more slowly, gripping his tongue more tightly in order to properly say the name. And eventually we get the name Gathanathoa, who I'm just going to call Gat for the rest of the video because I don't think the AI is going to tolerate me saying Gathanathoa properly. I just don't see that happening. The reason this presentation of how to say Gat's name is so interesting is because in his life, so many people would ask Lovecraft how to say the name Cthulhu, and Lovecraft would get like furious about this because the idea wasn't that you could say Cthulhu's name. Later, he would go on the record and say that the first part of the name, the C, is pronounced sort of like a cough, and the last part is, pronounced different than how it's spelled as well. Basically saying that you're not supposed to say the name. You're not supposed to be able to. This is an alien name. But eventually, he kind of settled down, yes, it sounds like a cough. So the real name of Cthulhu would be something like Hufulu. So after being introduced to each other, there's a snarky back and forth where Wes decides that, he wants to have a god name and he wants to be referred to as Thor, which, kind of funny touch. And that is something that's going on in this movie. It is a horror comedy. There are a few times where I legitimately laughed at just what were obvious jokes. While this is going on, Wes decides he's going to take a peek through the hold that I don't know the name of or what it's for. And he kind of gets like shouted at in like this booming voice. And then Gat informs Wes that he cannot look upon his form. And in defiance of this, Wes looks over the top of the stall and gets shouted into oblivion and ends up asleep on the floor, bleeding from the ears. And this is where we get like the dream scenes in this movie, which either take place in a completely black void or are corrupted and twisted. And I think this is another good thing that other directors should look at when doing Lovecraftian horror. If your character in a Lovecraft adaptation is going to sleep, they have to be besieged by nightmares. That is just Lovecraft down to the bone. 90% of what Lovecraft wrote was based on his own nightmares, so you gotta have it in there. So Wes is trapped in this bathroom. He can't leave through the door, and it seems like there's no way to escape. Gat then goes into an explanation of his own history and why he can't be viewed. And this is where, like, the very small amount of influence from the horror at the museum comes into the movie. Gthanathoa being the sort of evil god that turned the mummy in the museum into a mummy. Looking on Gthanathoa in the horror at the museum turns you into a mummy with a still working brain. In this movie, though, it turns you into some sort of godless abomination. And while all this is being explained to Wes, he's unscrewing a vent and trying to get out of the restroom through this vent. And this is where we get like another really good Lovecraft touch. There's this scene where he's crawling through the vent and then he starts climbing upwards and the camera shifts sideways. And you realize before Wes realizes that he's no longer going up, he's going sideways again, and he just reemerges in the bathroom. And this is just another great Lovecraftian touch because non-Euclidean geometry, harsh geometry, geometry that doesn't make sense is a very important component of his storytelling in many, many stories. After he realizes he's now truly stuck, Gthanathoa starts putting up these images, like transmitting them directly into Wes's brain and putting them as graffiti on the wall and tells the story of his creation. And while the god that spawned Gthanathoa is never described, this sort of chaotic being that existed before all of the things is never named, I think it's pretty obvious that it's Azathoth because Azathoth is pretty much the top of the hierarchy when it comes to the elder gods. Even the story that Gat tells about his father is that he is sort of trapped in like the deepest, darkest pit in the universe, which is sort of the fate of the Mad Sultan Azathoth as well. So again, another great historical touch from the works of Lovecraft. Now, to sort of lightning round what happens next, the property manager named Gary shows up and eventually breaks into the bathroom and is completely devastated and destroyed and turned into, for the sake of this video, raspberry jelly that flows from the sky and just covers everything in the bathroom. I'm going to call it raspberry jelly, okay? He turned him into raspberry jelly. That's what this is. It's just raspberry jelly, okay? Just trust me. After this, we get more information about Gat, how his father is hunting him, and if Gat comes into full physical form, he will destroy the entirety of the earth. So it is up to Wes to make a sacrifice to Bethanathola to keep him in his ethereal state that his siblings put him into so that his father couldn't find him. Wes doesn't like this idea and kind of just talks about how much he hates people and how people are responsible for every crappy thing that ever happened. And honestly, Wes isn't wrong. So he starts calling out to Guthanathoa's father, who I presume to be Azathoth, and the walls kind of start cracking, and we see this glimpse into this void of space as this amalgamation amoeba shape kind of comes into perspective. And the closer it gets, the more damage it's doing. It's starting to create this vortex that's pulling in everything, and Wes has to go into the stall to not be sucked into space or into Azathoth's gravity, whatever it may be. I'm going to leave the ending of this movie a little bit vague, just so there's something for you to kind of go into it and still not know. But eventually, after a small misunderstanding about what Gat means by satisfy his physical corporeal form, Wes decides to make the sacrifice necessary to stop Guthanathola from becoming physical and letting his father know where the earth is and ending all of humanity. But we learn through this process, in the end, both the physical form of Guthanathoa, which is hilariously bad. I know that the budget for this movie was only $650,000, and it did a lot more with a third of the budget than the most recent Color Out of Space adaptation did, but the form of Guthanathola is just hilariously bad. So bad. It's so bad. We also learned that Guthanathola and Wes have a little bit of something in common, and this is revealed in a conversation they have right before Guthanathola kind of just leaves. He kind of just disappears. He takes all the raspberry jelly with him too, which does open the door to the question of if any of this actually happened, which again is a great touch when it comes to Lovecraftian horror. The vagueness or the reality of the events is like quintessential Lovecraft. That is like the entirety of Dagon. Is anything in the story of Dagon real, or is the narrator unreliable and possibly insane? It's a very good touch, and it's something that I think future writers and directors need to keep in mind when adapting the works of Lovecraft, because occasionally the question of the reliability of the narrator is central to the story. That plays again into what I think is one of the most important components of a Lovecraft story, which is madness and obsession. So I've gone over the movie and I've highlighted a few points that I think are just excellent applications of what you can do with Lovecraft inspiration in a visual media. That being said, I do think it's a great movie. I think it's one of the best examples of how to do Lovecraftian horror. I think it's infinitely better than the Color Out of Space from, I think it was 2019, the one with Nicolas Cage. Which, by the way, if you're going to make a Lovecraftian movie, definitely cast Nicolas Cage to go insane. I think he's like the one actor who can adequately sell that, but I have So many problems with the color out of space. It's a whole different video. Sorry, I got a little sidetracked there, thinking about Nicolas Cage and his possible future casting and Lovecraft adaptations. Back to Glorious. It's a good movie. It is a good application of Lovecraftian style storytelling, especially in the sense that it focuses on madness and a singular location. But the thing that really burns my toast about this is that the writers say it's based on The Horror at the Museum by Lovecraft and Hazel Heald, which is just insane to me. 99% of this movie has nothing to do with that story. That story is an excellent story. It's available on my channel, and I will link it in the card. And there is not a single instance in that story where the protagonist is caught in a bathroom with an elder god. That just doesn't happen. And it's so weird to me that they say it's based on it. It's not based on it at all. There's very little DNA from The Horror at the Museum in here. So, final verdict, I'm Glorious. Despite being a little bit schlocky and a little disingenuous with what it's based on, I give it 3.5 out of 5 bathroom trapped elder gods. As an adaptation of The Horror at the Museum, 0.1 out of 5 bathroom bound elder gods. Definitely give it a look. If you liked this video, please leave a comment down below, letting me know what you particularly liked about this format of video. If you can, leave a like and a subscribe if you're new to the channel. And I think that's going to be all. For now, that will be AI Lovecraft signing off.